everybody, it's Sarah, and today I want to talk about Own Voices books and my thoughts on Own Voices books and my thoughts on problems that I see in the discussion surrounding Own Voices books. I had originally planned for today to film my part 2 of my cultures in fantasy video. However, then there were some discussions going on Twitter, so I decided to film something a bit more topical because I have a lot of thoughts on this topic and I wanted to share them. Now, the two discussions that I saw on Twitter concerning Own Voices were, on the one hand, Own Voices as they pertain to BIPOC authors, and more specifically, what happens when white authors come into the spaces that should be reserved for BIPOC authors and take away opportunities from BIPOC authors to tell their own stories. And then the other discussion surrounding Own Voices that was going on yesterday as of the filming of this video was after the author of Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda, I have forgotten her name, was forced to come out as bisexual because she has been attacked a lot in the past few years for writing queer stories while the readers or the people thought that she is a cishet woman. And so I think both of those discussions are kind of the two sides of the same coin that is Own Voices, and so I wanted to talk about that. First, I want to talk about Own Voices as concerning BIPOC authors. I won't talk as long about that because, first of all, I have a part of this discussion that I had already planned to talk about in my Cultures in Fantasy video part 2, and I do not want to repeat myself. And then second of all, I think it's pretty obvious that I am white. And so I do not think that me being white automatically excludes me from certain discussions, because I think we can share our thoughts and opinions on any topic as long as we think about those opinions, as long as we think about where those opinions come from, as long as we're aware of biases that we have ourselves because of our own experiences. And then also connected with that, and I do want to preface my talk about BIPOC authors and Own Voices with that while my opinions might be valid, because I do think I'm someone who I think a lot about where my thoughts come from generally, but I do think that in certain discussions not every opinion has the same level of importance. And when it comes to discussions about the experiences of BIPOC people, then of course me as a white person, I might add my opinion to the pool of thoughts and opinions, but it's not the first one people should listen to. And so I do very much want to preface that. And if you only go to white people for their opinions on BIPOC issues, then maybe rethink that a little bit. That's what I wanted to say. First of all, I want to say I love Own Voices. I love it because I know I'm supporting authors that are part of marginalized groups, but I also love it because if you read stories where you know they come from own experiences, or even if you don't know, but a lot of times if you read stories that come from own experiences, they, at least for me, they suck me in more. They feel more engaging, more realistic. I have that a lot with fantasy. I do have a handful of fantasy over here that are in non-white settings or in Asian-inspired settings, but that are written by white authors. And while I did enjoy the stories, otherwise I wouldn't have kept them, I do think that the settings, the Asian setting, add a lot less to the story and feel a lot less lived in, feel a lot more just simply aesthetic compared to Girls of Paper and Fire or Spin the Dawn. Just stories that are written by authors that come from those cultures. But I also think that in the perfect world, anybody would be able to write any story that they want, as long as it's not actively harmful to anyone, and as long as it doesn't stereotype a group of people or anything along those lines. However, we do not live in a perfect world. And we live in a world that very much gives white authors a lot more opportunities to publish book. It also gives white authors a lot more money to publish books, which is kind of iffy, thinking about you might have two stories that are surrounding BIPOC characters and are surrounding BIPOC experiences, and the white author will be paid way more to write something that isn't even their experience compared to the BIPOC author that is actually writing about their own experience. And then another problem, and by the way, this is kind of based on assumptions as far as what I have seen. I do not know if BIPOC authors just mostly write own voices stories because they want to, which I think is a big part of it, because of course most of the stories we have are white. So you don't want to add to this. But I think even if BIPOC authors wanted to write outside the own voices experience, I think they wouldn't be allowed to write it. I think they wouldn't get like publishing deals to write outside of their own experience. So the thing that BIPOC authors are allowed to write, whether they want to write that or not, is already like very much a niche that they can write. And then additionally to that, you have white authors encroaching in those spaces and taking away opportunities from BIPOC authors to write their own stories. And that is why 100% with BIPOC own voices, I will always support own voices over the white authors. And now we come to kind of the crossroads between BIPOC own voices and other own voices. Because the thing is, with BIPOC own voices, it is very easy to know what own voices is. I mean, there's still things that are less clear, let's say like that. For example, I think that's especially the case with like American-born minorities. For example, if you're an Afro-American author but you write an African culture inspired fantasy, can you call it like own voices? However, then I'd also ask the question, does it really matter? Because like the reason that we have own voices is to push marginalized authors and marginalized voices. So like I'm still supporting a black author who has less opportunities than a white author, so does it really matter in the end if the book is own voices? And also there are some authors that I have on my shelves where I think they'd be own voices, but I'm just not sure, and I cannot find information anywhere whether or not they are actually own voices. One example I have here is Crown of Feathers by Nikki Pau-Preto, which, I mean, it doesn't sound like a typically American name. It says she's Canadian, but I have not found out. I think the book is like South American inspired at least, but I don't know if she has any South American heritage herself. Same with, I have not read yet, City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. I know it's Middle Eastern inspired or like Northern African inspired fantasy. I do not know if she has Northern African or Middle Eastern like heritage. Her last name again does not necessarily sound Western, but I don't know, to be honest. Which, by the way, on both of those authors, if you have the info, I'd be like very happy if you could give that info to me. So you see already with BIPOC authors where it seems very clear of, are you a marginalized author writing own voices or aren't you? There's some things that might get blurred a little bit. However, things are even more unclear in like other spaces concerning own voices authors. And I'm going to talk specifically about queer stories and stories with disability rep. And with both of those, I can talk at least a little bit from my own experience. And I say a little bit because both of those are things that are like very broad spectrums of experiences. I cannot by far talk about all disability rep. I can mostly talk about ciclit and disability rep concerning cancer. And of course, with queer rep, I can mostly talk about bisexual rep. And first of all, yes, if you are an author who can say, hey, I'm own voices for either this or this queer rep or this disability, and you can say and you want to say, hey, hello, here I am, I'm an own voices author, absolutely, I will support you, and like, yes, yes, yes. However, the thing is, with LGBT, a lot of times people cannot be open about that People might not be able to like talk about it because they're scared that their family will find out and that will have like serious repercussions. It might have repercussions for a job if you're maybe a debut author and you still have like a side job, of course, because like, let's be honest, being an author, especially starting out as an author, might not always be like the easiest way to jump in. You might have to have other jobs. And then also, maybe you do not yet know that it's Own Voices. We do write as well to kind of find out more about ourselves and to kind of bring things within us to the light. And we pour ourselves in stories, and maybe through writing the story we start the process of coming to terms with our own identities. And I do not think it's right to take that away from authors just because you think they're cishet authors. And I do get that we want Own Voices representation. I feel myself incredibly seen when I know like a bisexual character has been written by a bisexual author. But I'm also a bit less like strict with myself concerning like Own Voices authors when it comes to LGBT. I have a lot of books with LGBT main characters where I'm not sure if the author is LGBT like themselves, because it's not always that easy to find out. By the way, I have that same thing with like getting arcs to Own Voices reviewers for LGBT stuff, where I'm like, I get the frustration when you see like people who you think are straight getting arcs for the type of representation that you feel seen in. However, you do not know what that other person might be going through and whether or not that other person is even open and like has come out about their sexuality, and whether or not maybe this book that they're now getting an arc from might be the book that like helps them come to terms with themselves. And so that's what I kind of find hard when talking about Own Voices and LGBT, because you really do not know the circumstances of that person. Same thing goes with disability rep. I have recently made a video on why I hate Ciclet, and I will leave that link down below and up there. And I had originally planned also to talk about that, but then I got too like annoyed at the genre in and of itself, which, by the way, I still completely stand by all the points that I said in that video. But I forgot to talk about Own Voices rep with disability, where yes, I do think that Own Voices and disability rep is incredibly important. But yes, I also do agree that, especially when it comes to like illnesses and those things, they are often connected to an incredible amount of trauma. And so maybe an author might not be ready to talk about the trauma. I am lucky enough that 2 years after my cancer treatment, I can already talk openly about my trauma without like feeling anything. It's like I had to do a lot of work to get to the point where I am right now. So I absolutely do not fault any author for like not being able to openly discuss their trauma, because if they are open about the trauma, then obviously interviewers are gonna ask them about it. And maybe they don't want that yet. Maybe they're not like ready for that. And so there are a lot of Own Voices, LGBT and disability, where I do think that we need to be less harsh with the authors, and that we do need to be careful like what we say and what we assume. That being said, and that goes for books that you know are Own Voices, and it goes for books that you're not sure are Own Voices, and that goes for books that you know aren't Own Voices, like specifically no. And that is that the contents are always up to criticism. Like, criticize away. Just being an Own Voices author, whether you're open about it or not, does not bar you from writing harmful content about the community that you belong to. I have heard that yesterday a lot, that like the authors from Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda, her second book, I think it's called Leah on the Offbeat, apparently has a lot of internalized homophobia and a lot of negative, like problematic stuff, including like the bi rep. And so you're completely free to criticize away. I do not think that you can automatically, just because it's negative like representation, that you can automatically conclude that the author isn't Own Voices, but like criticize away. The same with Cichlid. I will hate Cichlid that romanticizes terminal illnesses no matter if I know the author has gone through the same experience or not. Like, just don't romanticize it. I don't even care if maybe the romanticizing of the illness was like a way to deal with the trauma for the author. Then use that, write your book, but then don't publish it. Because publishing romanticizing terminal illness is incredibly harmful. By the way, I forgot about that, like, disabilities, illnesses also of course includes mental illnesses, where you maybe also don't want to be open about it and don't want to talk about the trauma. And so, yeah, being an Own Voices author, writing your own experiences does not necessarily mean that you cannot also write things that are harmful for the community. Because, like, for example, I have also every now and again seen on Twitter discussions whenever a new book comes out or a new story comes out following the storyline of like a Muslim girl shedding her religion and suddenly she's so free and it's amazing. Sometimes those stories weren't Own Voices, but sometimes those stories were Own Voices as well. And I do think that you should be able to write those stories, but I think you can also still be criticized for them, because no matter my own thoughts or on any religion, it is true that especially with like Muslim stories, there are certain narratives that are being pushed. So maybe the narrative in itself isn't necessarily all that harmful. I mean, like, put it in a Christian religion. You can have that story of like someone coming from a very religious background and kind of having or trying to find themselves outside of their religion. I think it's not necessarily automatically a negative story. However, what makes the story specifically concerning like Muslim characters negative is that our majority white publishing industry tries to push the narratives where they wouldn't push the narrative in the same way with another religion. And also they do not then at the same time publish stories that are incredibly positive concerning the Muslim experience. And also the same again, I talked about that in my Cichlid video, where I do not necessarily mind stories centering terminal illnesses. However, what I do mind is, first of all, of course, the romanticization, but what I do also mind is that you only then have one narrative that is pushed, and that narrative is kind of the I give up my treatment and I have my bucket list and I die at the end. Or like it's all dramatic and horrible and so negative, and you don't have the narratives of someone fighting with an illness, maybe with a chronic illness, with a terminal illness, where it ends positively and where maybe they just go through everyday life. And so I think there's so many nuances to Own Voices stories and to the discussion of Own Voices that it's kind of a disservice to say Own Voice is good, non-Own Voice is bad, and don't you dare read any book that isn't specifically written by someone who is an Own Voices author, and absolutely praise every book that is written by an Own Voices author, because it's Own Voices, it's based on their own experience. So you can only praise it, because otherwise you're a horrible person and you would bash the experience of said author. Where I do think there is certainly a way to criticize the contents of a book and like the portrayal and the framing of something in a book without criticizing the experience of the author, who might or might not be Own Voices. So yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to say in this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, maybe think about giving me a thumbs up and also maybe subscribing. Leave in your comments down below your thoughts on Own Voices books and how you deal with reading Own Voices. All the links to my social media are in the description box down below, so go and check those out. And also all the links to my book club are in the description box down below, so go and check those out as well. And I hope I'll see you soon. Bye!